Hi everyone, I'm Doug from DigiPen in Redmond. In this video, we'll discuss the information we display on the screen in what's called a HUD. What does a player need to keep in mind while playing a game? Most games have information that is important for the player to know. Information about what's happening in the game while they are playing it. This typically includes things like how much health they have left, what their score is, how many enemies are left to defeat, and so on. We need a way to tell the player some of these things, and that's where a HUD comes in. A game's HUD is the text and images it uses to tell the player information about what's going on in the game. This can include their score, lives, ammunition, time remaining, and so on. HUD stands for Heads-Up Display. This term is borrowed from aviation. Airplanes often put critical information on the windscreen so that the pilot doesn't always need to look down at their instruments to check them. Instead, they can keep their head up to look at the display, hence Heads-Up Display. Of course, the player of a video game doesn't have instruments they can look at even if they wanted to take their eyes off the action. So it's all the more important for a game designer to choose carefully what information they want to put on the screen. Does your hero have HP? That should probably be shown somewhere. Does your game have a time limit? The player should always be able to see it. Some things are important but may be safely left out of the HUD. For example, some games only show the player their score between levels or in the pause screen. There's no single best way of showing this information to the player. Sometimes it's good to use a number, such as for showing the player's score or what level they're on. Sometimes a meter works well, such as a health bar that shows the hero's HP. In some cases, the number of copies of a symbol can represent the value of a variable, such as showing how many lives the hero has with a row of icons. You can even use the appearance of a sprite itself to show the player information. For example, some games use the hero's face as an indicator of their health. It's also important to consider what your game should call the pieces of information presented in the HUD. The variable that stores the hero's health might be called HP in the game's code, but you can label it however you like in the HUD. Of course, you can still call it HP, or you can write it out as hit points or health, but depending on the theme of your game, it might be cooler to call it something like energy, vitality, or courage, or something along those lines. If your hero is a robot, you could call it battery power. If you control a ship or some other kind of vehicle, it might be appropriate to call it hull. Or you can even just label it with an icon, like a heart or a bolt of electricity. As long as the player understands what it means, it's up to you. In Scratch, it's easy to make a HUD by creating a sprite and adding text and graphics as necessary. The parts of the HUD that do not change can all be a part of this sprite's costume, and everything else can be added afterward as variable watchers or separate sprites. For example, to show the score, you can add the word score here, and then move the score variable watcher underneath it. Let's design a nice HUD for Scratch Invaders that fits its theme better than these plain variable watchers. Load what you've already done in that project, or visit the link in the description below, and then click the See Inside button. We'll begin by creating a new sprite. Move the mouse pointer over the Choose a Sprite button in the sprite pane, and then click the Paint option that appears above it. The new sprite is added, and the Costumes tab is automatically selected. Before we begin designing the HUD, change the sprite's name to HUD. Also, set its X and Y positions both to 0. This way, when we use the costume editor, the corners of this rectangle will match up with the corners of the game window, and this crosshair will match up with the center of the window. Let's create the score label. It's fine to use the brush tool to write the words in your HUD by hand. In fact, it can really enhance the theme if you put some effort into it, but it's perfectly fine to use the text tool to save time. Select the text tool and then click anywhere inside the costume editor. Type the word score. It's important to choose a good color for the text to help ensure that the player can read it easily. Let's make the text's color white and then give it a black shadow. Click the color picker and then drag the sliders so that the saturation is set to 0 and the brightness is set to 100. We'll add that shadow soon, but first, let's choose a font that works well. Click the font picker and look through the options. You can select a font and see a preview of how it will look. We'll go with Pixel, but you can choose anything you like. Now, to give the text a shadow, we'll just duplicate it and change the copy's color to black. Select the arrow tool and then click the copy button. Then click the paste button and a copy of the text will be added. Now, with the copy still selected, click the color picker and set the brightness to 0. Next, click the back button up here to move the shadow to the back layer of the costume so that it looks like it's behind the white text. Now move the shadow into position. You can do this with the mouse, but it might be easier to use the arrow keys to nudge it just a little bit at a time. Once the shadow is in place, drag select both the white text and the shadow, and then click the Group button. This combines the two texts so that they can be manipulated as one object. Now, it's certainly not right to leave this score label here in the center of the game window, so where should we put it? Well, think about other video games you may have played that show you your score. Where do they put it on the screen? It's often found at the top in one of the corners. Let's put it in the top left corner. The variable watchers are sitting there now though, so drag them out of the way first. Then drag the score label to the top left corner in the costume editor. Pay attention to the game window and position it carefully in the corner. It's nice to make it so that the spacing between the text and the left edge of the window is about equal to the spacing between the text and the top edge. Once you're happy with its position, we can put the variable watcher underneath it. Currently, the watcher shows both the name of the variable and its value, but we can change it so that it just shows the value. We don't need it to show the name. That's what the label is for. Right-click the Score variable watcher and select the Large Readout option. Now drag the watcher into position beneath the score label. Next, let's add a label for the hero's HP. What should you call the hero's HP? It depends on the theme of your game and who your hero is. Since our game's hero is a submarine, we'll go with hull, indicating the structural integrity of its hull, but you can choose whatever you like. Select the text tool again and click in the costume editor. Type whatever label you've decided on for the HP variable, and then click the color picker. You can use plain white text if you like, but it can also be nice to choose something that's more thematically meaningful. In our case, since the submarine's hull is yellow, we'll make the HP label text yellow. Now we'll give it a shadow, so duplicate it the same way as you did the score label. Select the arrow tool, click Copy, and click Paste. Set the shadow's color to black, and then click the back button to move it behind the colored text. Scoot the shadow into position with the mouse or the arrow keys, then drag select the colored text and the shadow and click Group. Now, where should this label go? We could put it in the upper left, near the score, but that might look a little too crowded. Let's put it in the top right corner, at the same height as the score label, but on the right instead of the left. After you're satisfied with its placement, right-click the Hero HP variable watcher and select the Large Readout option. Then drag the watcher over to the right and put it beneath the HP label. Now there's a HUD element in each of the top corners, giving the screen a nice, balanced look. Now it's time to try it out, but before you click that green flag, with the arrow tool selected, click somewhere in the empty space in the costume editor to deselect the HP label object. Remember, you control the game with the arrow keys, which are also used to move the selected object in the editor. You don't want to move your HUD elements around after you've decided so carefully where to put them. Now click the green flag to try the game out. The HUD looks much more professional now with our custom labels. Let's recap what we've learned in this video. First, we learned what the HUD is in a video game, the text and images that it uses to tell the player information about what's going on in the game. We learned that the letters in HUD stand for Heads Up Display, which is borrowed from aviation. Next, we discussed some of the different methods that a HUD can use to convey information to the player, such as by printing a number with text, changing the size of a bar, like for a health bar, and so on. Then we discussed the ways that a game's HUD fits into its theme, such as the words it uses to refer to the game's variables. Finally, we created a HUD for Scratch Invaders. In the next video, we'll learn about the crucial game design concept of feedback.